Today we're going to talk about one of the most shocking and controversial events in the Bible, an episode marked by fear, despair, and a decision that altered the history of generations. What leads two women to seduce their own father? Was it a strategic choice or a reflection of the corruption of Sodom? The truth behind this act is deeper than it seems. The destruction of Sodom was just the beginning of the tragedy in the lives of Lot and his daughters. Isolated in a cave, far from everything they knew, they believed that the entire world had been destroyed. But were they really alone? Or were their minds already corrupted to the point of seeing sin as the only alternative? What happened in that cave didn't just stay in the past. The mistake made there gave rise to two peoples who would become mortal enemies of Israel. Can an act of desperation change the course of history? The consequences of that moment surpassed generations and carried a weight that few imagine. But the most impressive thing isn't what happened that night, but the unexpected ending of that lineage. How could such a serious mistake, centuries later, directly connect with the coming of Jesus? There are hidden details in this story that most people never notice. Stay until the end, because this truth will surprise you. But first, do you want to discover more about the mysteries and curiosities of the Bible? Subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities of splendor and abundance, but behind their glittering walls hid an abyss of depravity. Unbridled lust and corruption corroded its inhabitants, who lived without limits or fear of the Creator. In Genesis 13:13, Scripture already announces, "Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Greed took over the hearts of its leaders, and injustice spread like poison among the people. The poor were exploited, visitors outraged, and any trace of righteousness ridiculed." The prophet Ezekiel denounces that Sodom was immersed in arrogance, abundance of bread, and indifference to suffering. Carnal pleasures began to rule the nights of the city. Men and women indulged in vices and abominable practices, ignoring all divine instruction. The perversion was so great that even the presence of strangers was not respected. In Genesis 19, we see that even the angels of the Lord were targets of the distorted desires of the Sodomites. There were no limits to wickedness. Sin became culture, and impiety a lifestyle. It was a place where no one was punished for their iniquity, for the laws had been molded to rebellion. Isaiah 3:9 says, "The look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Impunity reigned, and spiritual destruction advanced like an uncontrolled fire. Justice was subjugated by depravity, and those who tried to oppose it were silenced. The cry of the innocent rose to the heavens, and the Lord in his holiness could not ignore such perversion." The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about corruption, but about the danger of a people who reject eternal principles. Free will was used to plunge into sin, and men began to call evil good and good evil. When a society reaches this point, its fate is sealed. The cities became an icon of human manipulation. The inhabitants believed they were untouchable, that wealth and pleasures would guarantee safety. But they forgot that God's patience has a limit, and that he will never allow injustice to prosper indefinitely. Even the righteous who lived there were contaminated. Lot's presence was not enough to prevent moral decay, for evil was already rooted. Abraham interceded for those places, asking that they be forgiven if there were at least 10 righteous people, but not even that was found. The warning was given, but hearts were hardened. Sodom and Gomorrah are an eternal reminder that God is patient, but not complicit in iniquity. The rain of sulfur was about to fall, for when the cup of divine wrath overflows, justice manifests itself in a non-negotiable way. But before destruction arrived, a man and his family needed to make a decision to change their lives forever. They should abandon everything and run to salvation. But would everyone understand the gravity of the situation? Lot was a prosperous man, but his vision was clouded by the glitter of riches. When he separated from Abraham, he saw the plains of the Jordan, fertile and well-irrigated, like Eden itself. His choice was strategic, but he didn't realize that the beauty of that land hid a spiritual poison. He pitched his tents near Sodom, a place of declared impiety. Perhaps he believed he could resist or even influence that society, but little by little his soul was being corroded. The environment shapes us, and Lot underestimated the impact that city would have on his home. It wasn't long before he was not just an inhabitant, but a respected figure among the Sodomites. When the angels arrived, he was sitting at the city gate, a sign that he had become a local authority. But to what extent can a righteous person live with sin without being contaminated? The prosperity of Sodom was seductive. While the world saw Lot as a successful man, spiritually he was sinking. He became part of that system, perhaps justifying his choices with common excuses. I'm just ensuring my family's future. But what is wealth worth when the soul is at risk? His values became confused. When the angels came to rescue him, he treated them as honored guests. But when faced with the threat of the Sodomites, he offered his own daughters to satisfy the crowd. The fear and pressure of the environment had already distorted his judgment. Lot didn't realize that by trying to preserve his position and possessions, he was endangering what really mattered. He clung to Sodom, and when the time came to flee, his hesitation almost cost him his life. The angels had to take him by the hand to get him out of there. The influence of sin is insidious. The man who walked with Abraham and knew the Most High God was slowly being absorbed by the culture of Sodom. His wife and daughters were also impacted. How can a family remain whole when its foundation is built on damaged ground? Lot's decision seemed logical in human eyes, but disastrous spiritually. He did not seek God's direction. He trusted only in what he saw. Just as many today choose promising paths without considering the spiritual price, Lot paid dearly for not discerning beyond appearances. God in his mercy sent a warning, but wrong choices took root, and fleeing Sodom required not only leaving physically, but also uprooting Sodom from the heart. The problem was his family really ready to leave everything behind? As destruction approached, one last test would define the fate of Lot's wife and daughters. The escape required absolute obedience, but would everyone understand the gravity of that moment? The sky was overcast, and the smell of judgment hung in the air. The angels were clear. The city would be destroyed, and Lot needed to leave without looking back. But the escape was not just physical. It was a call to cut ties with everything that bound them to that corrupt land. Obedience would be their only salvation. Lot hesitated. Perhaps it was the attachment to possessions, perhaps the disbelief that judgment would really come. The angels had to take him by the hand and hurry him, for God's mercy insisted on saving him. To what extent can a man's heart be divided between divine security and attachment to the world? The warning was clear: flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away. Genesis 19:17. But Lot's fear still spoke louder. He asked permission to take refuge in Zoar, a smaller town, fearing that the mountain would be his end. His faith was fragile. The family ran, but something inside them still pulled them back. Lot's wife, who had lived surrounded by the luxury of Sodom, couldn't break with the past. In a moment of weakness, she looked back, and there she met her fate. God's judgment was manifested, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. That vision was a reminder that you cannot walk with God, and at the same time, keep your heart attached to what he condemns. Lot's wife didn't just look back. She longed for what she left behind. Her body left Sodom, but her spirit was still there. Lot and his daughters continued on, while behind them fire and sulfur consumed the city. The laughter and festivities of Sodom were replaced by the roar of judgment. What was once a fertile land now became a cursed desert. Human greatness could not stand against divine wrath. The man who once prospered in Sodom now became a wanderer. The fate of his wife was a harsh blow, but he couldn't stop. His only option was to move forward, carrying with him the consequences of his choices. But did he understand the depth of what he had lost? Lot's daughters witnessed everything. They saw the city burn, heard the cries, and experienced the pain of loss. Fear began to dominate their minds. If Sodom was destroyed and Zoar didn't seem safe, what was left for them? Uncertainty became their new home. Lot, who had bet on the glitter of Sodom, now found himself with nothing. The city he chose destroyed him. and the land he coveted so much turned to ashes. Everything he possessed was lost in a single night, but physical destruction was just the beginning of an even greater tragedy. Refuge in Zoar would not last long. Fear and guilt multiplied into constant companions. Lot's daughters realized that the whole world had been destroyed, and their lineage was at risk. Despair began to sow dangerous thoughts, setting the stage for the darkest act in this story. Dawn brought with it the weight of justice. As Lot and his daughters moved away, the sky over Sodom and Gomorrah became a stage for divine judgment. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Genesis 19:24. The warning was given, but the people preferred to mock the truth. Now there was no more time for lamentations. What was once a fertile valley, full of life and riches, became a hell on earth. The ground trembled, the houses collapsed, and a deafening roar filled the place. The heat was unbearable, and the flames consumed everything they encountered. No wealth could save the inhabitants, for God's justice cannot be bribed. The cries echoed through the streets, but there was no escape. Those who had indulged in perversity would now face its consequences. In an instant, Sodom and Gomorrah went from prosperous cities to ashes. Everything they worked for, everything they built, was erased from history. Like Sodom and Gomorrah, says the Lord, no one will live there. Jeremiah 49:18. The destruction was total. The fire not only consumed the buildings, but transformed the earth itself. What was once a symbol of abundance was now a cursed desert. Centuries later, the Dead Sea is still spoken of, an eternal reminder of what happens when a people defy the limits of divine patience. The fall of Sodom was not just physical, but moral and spiritual. God did not destroy the city without reason. He had given warnings with time for repentance, but the hearts of men were hardened. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Matthew 24:12. They lost all ability to distinguish right from wrong. The riches of Sodom could not buy mercy. The political influence and military power of its leaders were no match for divine judgment. Those who trusted in their strength realized too late that there is no escape when God closes the door of grace. Lot, looking back, not physically, but in his heart, knew that everything he had pursued in life was now nothing more than smoke. His wife would pay a high price for nostalgia, and he would carry the weight of the consequences of his choices. The glitter of Sodom had faded, but its marks would still echo through the generations. The ashes of the city were not only a symbol of destruction, but a warning to all humanity. As Jesus said in Luke 17:28-30, the world will continue to live as in the days of Sodom, ignoring the signs until judgment falls again suddenly. The lesson is clear. God's patience is great, but his justice never fails. And so, among ashes and fears, Lot and his daughters went into the unknown. But the worst was yet to come. Isolation and uncertainty would give rise to a desperate decision, which would change the history of their descendants forever. Lot was no longer a prosperous man. He left behind fertile lands, possessions, and a position of prestige. Now he wandered like a refugee without a set course. What was once a dream of wealth turned into a nightmare of loneliness. He sought shelter in Zoar, but the fear of judgment made him retreat again. Lot and his two daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. Genesis 19:30. His daughters, once surrounded by luxury and promises of marriage, now found themselves isolated in a cave. The silence of the mountain was suffocating. There were no servants, no suitors, no future. Only the memory of the past and the fear of what was to come remained. For them, the world as they knew it had been erased. Lot was no longer the same. The man who once made decisions based on material vision was now haunted by the weight of loss. He saw his wife turned into salt, lost his possessions, and carried the shame of having allowed himself to be contaminated by the perversity of Sodom. His faith was shaken. The daughters grew up amidst the corruption of the city, where values were distorted. They lived surrounded by practices that turned the body into commodities and pleasure into currency. The idea that survival justified any act had become entrenched in their minds. Even far from Sodom, Sodom still lived within them. Isolation not only erases cities, but also references of morality. Without mothers, without husbands, without spiritual leaders, they decided they would take drastic decisions first. The uncertainty of the future caused their thoughts to stray down dangerous paths. Loneliness can lead to reflection or madness. In their case, despair spoke louder. We saw no other solution than to perpetuate the lineage by any means necessary. Their opinions had been distorted by the environment where they grew up, and now the mistake seemed to be the only way out. Sin does not always manifest abruptly. Sometimes it disguises itself as necessity, as a seemingly logical solution. The isolation of Lot's daughters caused them to see incest as a viable alternative, a reflection of a mind already corrupted by the customs of Sodom. Lot, worn out and broken, didn't realize that danger wasn't just outside. The threats were not the enemies that might attack them in the desert, but the thoughts that were being built in that cave. The human mind, when given over to despair, can demand the unjustifiable. Lot's daughters, isolated and consumed by fear, came to a dark conclusion. Without men around, their lineage would disappear. They saw no way out except to resort to their own father. "Come, let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him." Genesis 19:32. The corruption of Sodom still lived within them. In the city, sex was trivialized and morality distorted. For them, it wasn't an act of perversion, but of survival. Their hearts were hardened, their minds obscure. Sin does not always arise as rebellion. Sometimes it presents itself as a viable solution. They prepared the plan and made Lot drink until he lost his senses. The man who once ruled his house was now vulnerable, unaware of his own actions. Alcohol, which is so often an ally of sin, was a tool that eliminated any resistance. On the first night, the eldest daughter executed her plan. On the second, the youngest did the same. There was no remorse, only the certainty that we were ensuring the continuity of the lineage. The cycle of manipulation that began in Sodom was now completed in the cave. Lot, who strove so hard to preserve his family, fell unknowingly. The same man who offered his daughters to the perverse crowd was now a victim of their deception. The sin, which he tried to resist for so long, finally conquered him. It wasn't an act of violence, but of manipulation. The daughters conceived. Each gave birth to a son, fruit of an act that should never have happened. Moab and Ben-Ami were born marked by the obscure origin of their lineage. Their descendants would not only survive, but would become enemies of the people chosen by God. Incest didn't bring salvation, but expression. What seemed to be a plan to preserve Lot's family ended up generating nations that would turn against Israel. What is done in secret always has public consequences, and the children of Sodom, even outside Sodom, still carried their curse. Lot, upon awakening, had to face reality. His body was used without his consent, and the price would be paid for generations. He fled Sodom, but the tragedy reached him even in his cave. The man who once sat in the open spaces of the city now ended his life in humiliation. The story of Lot's daughters is a reminder that not every solution is a divine solution. There are paths that seem right in human eyes, but whose end is death. They thought they were guaranteeing a future, but they were in fact perpetuating a problem. And so from sin arose a descendants. Moabites and Ammonites grew as peoples distant from God, enemies of the holy people. The mistake in that cave would not be erased, and its consequences would echo throughout the centuries. But the destiny of these peoples still held unexpected surprises. The children of Lot's daughters were born, and with them a lineage that carried a stigma from the womb. Moab and Ben-Ami were not only descendants of a righteous man, but also the fruit of a decision made in darkness. Their names, however, carried the mark of the past. Moab means from the father, and Ben-Ami, son of my people, Genesis 19:37-38. Over the years, Moab and Ben-Ami became leaders, and their tribes began to expand. They inhabited the lands east of Israel in fertile and strategic regions. They had strength, their own culture, and rituals inherited from the customs of Sodom. Lot's isolation did not make them seek the true God, but rather erect their own beliefs. The nations descended from these children became perverse. Moab, in particular, would be remembered for idolatry and repulsive practices. One of their main gods was Chemosh, to whom they sacrificed human lives. The same spirit of Sodom, which Lot tried to leave behind, resurfaced in the religious practices of his descendants. The Ammonites, in turn, followed similar paths, worshiping Moloch and offering their own children in burnt offerings. Spiritual deviation led them to be fierce enemies of Israel, attacking and trying to corrupt God's people with their pagan traditions. The sin committed in the cave turned into a generational curse. The blood of Abraham still ran in them, but their covenant with God had been broken. Moab and Ammon saw Israel not as relatives, but as rivals. When the Hebrews came out of Egypt, they did not offer them passage or hospitality. The hostility between the peoples was sealed from the beginning. Even so, God did not destroy them immediately. Moab and Ammon had a purpose in history. It was a reminder that wrong choices can perpetuate destructive cycles, but also that God, in His sovereignty, can transform even what is born of sin into something redemptive. Centuries later, a Moabite would stand out in the history of redemption. Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David and ancestor of Jesus, would come from that lineage marked by error. The Lord showed that even amidst the shadows, His grace can generate light. The fate of Lot's descendants was not sealed forever. The story of Moab and Ben-Ami reveals that the consequences of sin can last generations, but also that God always reserves a path for redemption. What began with an act of desperation inside a cave would still have many developments. But before their descendants would likely face Israel face to face, conflicts between these nations would soon arise. Moab and Ammon not only rejected the God of Abraham, but became declared adversaries of his descendants. And the confrontation between these peoples and Israel would mark one of the most intense spiritual and political wars of the Old Testament. From the beginning, Moab and Ammon positioned themselves as opponents of Israel. Their blood ties were not enough to create an alliance, for their beliefs and practices distanced them from the God of Abraham. When the Israelites left Egypt and crossed the desert, they hoped to find hospitality among the peoples, but they were greeted with hostility. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy 23:3. Moab feared Israel. They knew that their God was powerful and that He had led them to victories over strong nations. The Moabite king Balak, desperate, sought a supernatural solution. He hired the prophet Balaam to curse the Israelites. Numbers 22:6. But God turned the curse into victory, frustrating Moab's plans. Unable to defeat Israel by spiritual power, the Moabites changed their strategy. They introduced their women among the Israelites, seducing them and leading them to idolatry and sacred prostitution. The plan worked, and many Israelites fell into this snare, provoking the wrath of God. The Ammonites followed a similar path, becoming constant enemies of Israel. During the time of the Judges, they attacked the Hebrews with violence and cruelty. Jephthah, one of the judges of Israel, deceived the Ammonites and defeated them, demonstrating that God would not allow His people to be subjugated by those who rejected His covenant. The rivalry between these peoples and Israel persisted for centuries. During the reign of Saul, the Ammonites planned to subject the Israelites to a humiliating pact, demanding that everyone gouge out their right eye to seal the submission. But God called Saul to deliver His people. In the times of David, the conflicts intensified. The king of Israel humiliated the Ammonites in battle, devastating their lands and weakening their power. Moab was also defeated and subjected to Israeli rule. What began as a simple blood tie was now a declared war between opposing descendants. Even in times of peace, Moab and Ammon never abandoned their resistance to Israel. When Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, these people celebrated the fall of the holy city. But the vengeance of the Lord came, and they also suffered ruin. Centuries passed, and the identity of these peoples was diluted in history. Their lands were conquered, their cultures absorbed by other nations. Moab and Ammon, who fought so hard against Israel, ceased to exist as independent kingdoms. But an echo of their history would still remain alive. From the soil of Moab, God would bring a great purpose. In the midst of an idolatrous people, a woman named Ruth made a decision to change her destiny. She would renounce her lineage to join the God of Israel, becoming part of the genealogy of Christ. The blood of the Moabites, marked by sin, would find redemption in divine grace. The conflicts between Moab, Ammon, and Israel show that there is no enemy that can resist God's plan. Peoples can rise up against him, strategies can be plotted, but in the end, the sovereignty of the Most High will always prevail. And even those who were born under the shadow of error, God can cause redemption to sprout. The story of Lot and his descendants is a reminder that our choices shape not only our destinies, but also that of the generations that come after us. When Lot decided to live near Sodom, it seemed like a strategic decision, a choice based on prosperity and the abundance of the land. But he did not realize that he was sowing a future of destruction. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. Proverbs 14:12. The environment in which we live shapes us more than we imagine. You may have entered Sodom with firm principles, but over the years you adapted to the corruption around you. His daughters grew up in this distorted environment, where sin was normalized, and carried this distorted view of life into their own decisions. Lot's daughters made decisions based on fear and a lack of spiritual vision. Without a firm faith, they interpreted their situation through desperation and not through trust in God. The result was an incestuous act that generated nations hostile to Israel. When we try to resolve things with our own strength, without seeking divine guidance, we run the risk of creating even greater problems. The material destruction of Sodom was not able to save its inhabitants. They had wealth, security, and influence, but ignored divine warnings. This teaches us that success in the eyes of the world means nothing if we are not in covenant with God. Everything can be destroyed in an instant. Even in the midst of the consequences, the mercy of God still shines. Lot was saved for the love of Abraham, showing the power of intercession. Often we are not forgiven for our own merits, but because someone prayed for us. Just as Abraham cried out for Lot, we can be instruments of salvation in the lives of others. The story of Moab and Ammon could have been just a testimony of judgment, but God, in His grace, brought redemption. Ruth, a Moabite, chose to leave her past behind and follow the God of Israel, becoming an ancestor of David and later of Jesus. The past does not define who we are when we give our lives to the Lord. The consequences of this act were not limited to the life of Lot and his daughters. The Moabites and Ammonites were declared enemies of Israel, perpetuating a cycle of conflict and idolatry that lasted for centuries. Sin generates fruit, and often these fruits carry thorns that hurt far beyond those who committed it. What starts as a however, God in His sovereignty always leaves a path for restoration. The story could have been just an account of decay, but from the lineage of Moab arose a woman willing to break with her past. Ruth, a Moabite, decided to follow the God of Israel and was rewarded by becoming an ancestor of King David and later of Jesus Christ. What began in sin was transformed. This teaches us that, no matter how deep the mistake, God can still write a new ending. The past does not define who we are when we choose to return to Him. The story of Lot's daughters is not just about tragedy, but about the impact of decisions and the power of restoration. Sin can generate destruction, but the grace of God is able to transform even the last stories into testimony. Thank you so much for watching this video and for joining us on this beautiful journey through the stories of the Bible. If you felt touched and inspired, subscribe to the channel to receive more content that deepens our faith and spirituality. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and share this video with others who are also seeking divine inspiration. May God bless you.